All right, joining us now is the Mets writer from The Athletic. Tim Britton is in Port St. Lucie. Tim, good to see you once again. And let's continue with this conversation about Tim Tebow. He's a guy who has succeeded at every level. He's expected to be in AAA this year, and there is a belief his ascension is tied to his popularity. How much truth is there to that?
You know, I do think that the reason, a lot of times you go into spring training and you don't say where your minor leaguers are going to end up at the end of spring training. You don't kind of reveal where guys are going to start the year. You haven't heard where Andres Gimenez, the Mets kind of consensus top prospect, is going to start the year, whether it's in AA or AAA. But with Tebow, I think because he is so popular and that's tied to ticket sales a little bit, the Mets kind of went ahead and said right away that he was going to start the year in AAA Syracuse. So I think that plays into it. That's a team the Mets franchise owns now in Syracuse. So that anything to boost the ticket sales in their first year there is probably pretty helpful.
I get it. There's also a possibility that, because he's an advanced aged player, maybe they're trying to push him along a little faster just to see if he can make those adaptations that most hitters try to make.
Yeah, certainly. He's not, Gimenez, the counterexample, is 20. Tebow is in his 30s now already. So you're not really wasting time with him. You want him to be as major league ready as possible if a need were to arise. I think if we look back at last year, if he hadn't broken his hamate bone in his hand in July, there's a real chance he would have been in the major leagues in the month of September. There's kind of a perfect storm of things that led to that possibility with a team that didn't have a lot of outfield depth, and now they are a little deeper in that area than they were last year. But it's not ridiculous to think of him as a guy who could be on the major league roster at some point this season, even before September.
Okay, so I guess I'll put this to you, because Mets fans are certainly all in on Peter Alonso. Management seems to be all in on Tebow. Who makes it to the bigs first?
Oh, I think that's still Alonso because there is more of a need at first base. The Mets have Todd Frazier and J.D. Davis. We haven't heard much of anything about Dominic Smith after the year he had last year. They've got Frazier and Davis as kind of options to start the season if they wanted to go that way. But they've been pretty aggressive in talking up Alonso all offseason. It started the first week of Brodie Van Wagenen was on the job. He went out to Arizona to meet with Alonso when he was playing in the Arizona Fall League, went out to dinner with him, talked to him, and said, from that point forward, this is a guy we think can be our opening day first baseman. There's a lot of talk about whether that makes sense long term because of service time issues and whether the Mets should leave him down in the minor leagues for at least the first 2 weeks of the season to save the 2025 season before he hits free agency. But the Mets have been pretty clear with their message that we're going to take the best 25 players. And looking at this lineup and kind of the lack of right-handed power, especially with Frazier coming off the year he had last year, you can make a really strong case at this point, early point of spring training, that Alonso's probably going to be one of those 25 best players.
I think it's pretty clear that Jacob deGrom is going to be the storyline of the spring. He has set opening day as the deadline to get a new deal done. But is there an urgency on the Mets side?
We haven't seen it to this point. Certainly, when the Mets kind of set up their offseason, their entire offseason from the time they hired Van Wagenen, deGrom's old representative, right, to be their general manager, to make it seem like they were all in on deGrom. They hire Van Wagenen, they build a team that's ready to contend now as deGrom, in the final 2 years of his deal. It seemed like it would make a lot of, it's just logically that they should sign him to an extension, but they haven't even exchanged offers at this point, and it doesn't sound like sometimes a formal offer is overblown, but it doesn't even sound like they're that deep into negotiations at this point, and there does seem to be a little bit of frustration from deGrom's side that they haven't really made any advancement at this point. A lot of times these negotiations happen in spring, so it's not a surprise that they haven't come to terms yet, but it's also not a surprise that deGrom wants to have it done by March 28th and opening day, if at all. So I think we'll start to see a little bit more urgency this time of year. But at this point, I would have said at the beginning of the offseason that it's likely that something gets done, and now I'm not quite as sure.
Thing is, I don't know where to land on this because I really do see both sides of the equation here. Let's not forget, the Mets did give him a record $10 million raise this year. Does that maybe signal their intention for a long-term deal, or might they feel that they've already done him a solid?
I mean, that's certainly a good faith move by the Mets to come to terms. They didn't go to an arbitration hearing the way a lot of other teams have the last couple of years, where you go in there and you have to argue against one of your better players. It's the largest raise in arbitration history, and it sets him up to make, he makes $17 million this year. It sets him up to maybe set a record next year as well in his final year of arbitration. So, from his side of things, he's in a pretty good spot to make a good amount of money over the next 2 years, but you kind of see where each side is coming from in terms of who has the leverage. deGrom is coming off, kind of a transcendent season. The Mets have been very clear on how good they think he is, and he is kind of the leader of that, not only that staff, but that clubhouse now with David Wright no longer there. He's kind of the face of the franchise, so he's got leverage in that regard. The Mets can kind of look at him and say, hey, you've got 2 years until you hit free agency. You're already going into your age 31 season. A lot of teams don't like to give out money to pitchers when they're turning 30, let alone 33, as deGrom will in free agency. And clearly the market isn't what it was even just a couple of years ago. So the Mets can kind of say, we've rewarded you for next year. We'll reward you for the year after that. And then we'll see where the market is at that point rather than diving in headfirst now.
All right. This is clearly a year for change for the Mets. They've got a new GM. They've got a new PR staff, a new medical staff. This franchise has had problems handling, I guess, the public perception of the injuries, bad timelines, misdiagnosis. Is there a belief, though, that at the very least the perception of the medical staff can change?
Yeah, I think this is year 2 for the medical staff that they brought in here, and that's the kind of thing that doesn't change overnight. Obviously, in terms of how they take care of players, there were still some issues last year in terms of messaging, specifically around Yoenis Cespedes, when he's essentially the one breaking news that he's going to have surgery, the way he did last year at Yankee Stadium. But I think the Mets look at their roster now and think they have the tools in place, not only to have extra guys there in case the inevitable injuries occur, but to limit those injuries in the first place because of what they're putting in place with that medical staff in terms of dealing with soft tissue injuries, better nutrition in the clubhouse. You hear some grumbles about it this time of year that the food is healthier now than it used to be just a couple of years ago. The chicken's grilled, but I think that, it's such we talk about it in baseball, it's a 162-day grind for these guys, 162 games in 186 days. It's really hard to stay healthy, even for guys who have solid track records. Todd Frazier going into last year had never been on the disabled list. Robinson Cano, plays 160 games a year basically up until last season. It's really hard to stay healthy, and the Mets, I think maybe the best thing they've done this winter is put themselves in a position to handle the inevitable injury when it happens to someone, that they have a major league quality player to step in and fill in for whatever time is needed.
Guess that's why they added some depth. You can get all of his thoughts on The Athletic. Mets writer Tim Britton. Thanks so much for your time, man.
Oh, anytime, Steve. Thank you.
Back after this.